Heyo! In this video, I am making a small treasure chest based off of the boss key chest from Zelda Wind Waker. I wanted to take a crack at a rounded top chest. It's not any kind of an exact map to the object from the game, but Wind Waker's designs are all rounded and swirly, and this was about as close as I could get. I had some scrap wood left over from another cut, and I used that because it seemed like it was just the right size to fit all of the pieces. Unfortunately, the wood wasn't perfect all the way through, and the darn plywood had a knot in the center somewhere, and the laser didn't cut all the way through. I ended up digging up another piece of scrap wood, measured it, laid out the pieces that hadn't cut properly before onto the size of the new sheet, and cut it. Much better! Now this is a clean cut. Time to sand every single piece. The chest has a second layer that I make out of 1/32 thick plywood, which is really thin plywood. This is the template for the second layer pieces. On these thinner pieces of plywood, the lines here don't cut all the way through, so I can crease the wood without it falling apart. Or at least that's the idea. In the end, the size still wasn't quite right, and I ended up having to break it up a bit. You'll see that later on. In any case, I'll need to adjust the widths for the next time I make one of these things. Time for more sanding! I have to be a lot more delicate with the thinner pieces because they can just snap. Time for the first coat of polyurethane on the lighter underwood pieces. And now, time to stain the dark top detail parts. After you've applied the stain and let it set for a minute, you need to wipe it off. If you don't, it takes much longer for it to dry, and the surface can be rougher and sometimes even tacky for like way longer than it should be. I let it sit overnight. It's an oil-based stain, so it's really important to let it dry before you apply the poly to it. Since it's been another day, the light-colored wood with its first coat of polyurethane is dried now. Now I sand it so that the surface is nice and smooth to the touch, and I can apply the second coat of poly. I apply the second coat with a much slower stroke and a steadier hand so that the surface is really smooth and will dry that way. Another day later, first coat of the dark wood has dried, and now it is time to sand it and apply the second coat of poly. Sanding this by hand this time, gotta be careful since I don't want it to break the wood. Plywood this thin is not super durable. One coat of high gloss poly can make the surface a bit shiny, but it's also rough to the touch. After it's sanded, and it's obviously not very shiny anymore. It's even really light colored and scuffed up looking, but this is okay. The light scuffed up look is totally gone with the second application of polyurethane. It's super shiny now, but it's also wet, so of course it's shiny. And now all the pieces are dry and ready to be assembled. Big old glob of glue in a pile. Toothpick application, handy for small notches. Rubber bands to hold it together so the glue can set. Assembling the lid is kinda tricky. The inner frame links together in several places so that you need to put them in the right order, or else you have to start popping things apart like I did here. Assembled and glued. Now to let it set for a bit. Setting done. Time to glue layer 2. You saw how shiny it was when it was wet, but that was wet. Here it is dry. Still very shiny, but now also very smooth and not wet. I have these little clamps, and I have little small squares of leftover scrap wood, and I use those to help hold the flat things flat, so that the glue can dry and everything is pressed down and I don't have to hold it the entire time. Have I mentioned how much I like that it's shiny? Now to do the lid. Like I said earlier, the lines don't cut all the way through, so it stays together and can be bent. But also, like I said earlier, the sizing isn't quite right either. So I ended up having to break it apart into pieces anyways. Oh well, I'll adjust the width and spacing and try again another time. Holding these pieces in place while the glue sets is a real pain in the butt. I ended up having to resort to using a lot of rubber bands. While that dries, I'm back to the base. I could stop here and call it done, but I want the edges to be smoother. I Dremel the corner edges and the feet to blend the base layer and the second layers together better. This leaves exposed wood that isn't stained or polyed, but I will be fixing that in a bit. And on to the lid. Here I Dremel the edges of the extending top lip part thing. I want to get the second layer and the main layer to blend nicely here too. Cracking open the stain again. I have these little Q-tip-like things that are actually makeup applicator sticks, and I get them off of Amazon in bulk. They're useful for loads of things, including applying stain to very small detailed areas. I need to stain the underside of the lip so that it blends together, since the part above it is dark and the part below it is dark, and it would be nice if the part in between was dark too. After all of that, the stain is dried, and I applied polyurethane to all of the newly exposed and stained edges. And I forgot to record it. Whoops. After the poly had dried, I needed to sand it all and make it smooth. And now I apply a second coat of poly to all of those edges. I do this part really carefully so as to not get polyurethane on places that I don't want it or need it. And finally, time to put on the hardware and assemble. Rubber bands hold it in place while I line up the hinges and mark the little spots with a Sharpie. I used a pointed burr on my Dremel to make tiny holes so that the screwing can screw in better. Even with teeny tiny screws, the points tend to pop through to the other side of the wood, and that's not cool. I used a sanding disc and my Dremel to grind down the pointed bits so that no one is going to poke their fingers when they open the chest. Woohoo! Done! Yes! And here's the final product! I've got these available on my Etsy shop if you like it and you want one. Also, I wanted to ask and see if anyone would be interested in me putting together tutorial type videos for the vector process, the part where I actually make the designs that the laser cuts out. I use Adobe Illustrator, so they'd be tutorials for Adobe Illustrator. I know it's not exactly super duper common for people to have laser cutters and actually be able to make the sort of stuff like this, but hobby lasers are becoming more common and more affordable and more accessible, so there could be some interest. Just know that I self-taught myself Illustrator and I self-taught myself designing little boxes and things, so I'm sure that I came up with all sorts of techniques and things that other people would call completely stupid and would look at it and go, "Wah! Why is she doing it that way? That's stupid. It would be so much better or efficient to do such and such way or use such and such application instead, and this is the stupidest way to do it, but it's the way I do it, and if anyone wants to see the way I do it, I'm totally willing to do that too." Let me know down in the comments. Other than that, feel free to subscribe if you like this and want to see more stuff like it or want to see tutorial videos in the future. And give this video a like if you liked it, because that would be snazzy and I would appreciate it. Also, if anyone has any ideas for other kinds of chests or boxes or lamps or whatever the heck that you think would be really cool if I would make, let me know down in the comments and I will probably try doing some of that stuff. Anyway, don't forget to be awesome and thanks for watching. Bye!